Sapiens, The Secret of Success. Commerce, empires, and universal religions eventually brought virtually every sapiens on every continent into the global world we live in today. Not that this process of expansion and unification was linear or without interruptions. Looking at the bigger picture though, the transition from many small cultures into a few large cultures and finally to a single global society was probably an inevitable result of the dynamics of human history. But saying that a global society is inevitable is not the same as saying that the end result had to be the kind of global society we now have. We can certainly imagine other outcomes. Why is English so widespread today and not Danish? Why are there about 2 billion Christians and 1.25 billion Muslims and only 150,000 Zoroastrians and no Manichaeans? If we could go back in time 10,000 years ago and set the process going again, time after time, would we always see the rise of monotheism and the decline of dualism? We can't do such an experiment, so we don't really know, but an examination of two crucial characteristics of history can provide us with some clues. Sapiens, the Hindsight Fallacy. Every point in history is a crossroads. A single travelled road leads from the past to the present, but a myriad of paths fork off into the future. Some of those paths are wider, smoother, and better marked, and are thus more likely to be taken. But sometimes history, or the people who make history, take unexpected turns. At the beginning of the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire faced a wide horizon of religious possibilities. It could have stuck to its traditional and variegated polytheism, but its emperor Constantine, looking back on the fractious century of civil war, seems to have thought that a single religion with a clear doctrine could help unify his ethnically diverse realm. He could have chosen any number of contemporary cults to be his national faith: Manichaeism, Mithridatism, the cults of Isis or Cybele, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, or even Buddhism were all available options. Why did he opt for Jesus? Was there something in Christian theology that attracted him personally, or perhaps an aspect of the faith that made him think that it would be easier to use for his purposes? Did he have a religious experience, or did some of his advisors suggest that Christians were quickly gaining adherents and it would be best to jump on the wagon? Historians can speculate, but not provide a definitive answer. They can describe how Christianity took over the Roman Empire, but they cannot explain why this particular possibility was realized. What is the difference between describing how and explaining why? To describe how means to reconstruct the series of specific events that led from one point to another. To explain why means to find causal connections that account for the occurrence of this particular series of events to the exclusion of all others. Some scholars do indeed provide deterministic explanations of the events, such as the rise of Christianity. They attempt to reduce human history to the workings of biological, ecological, and economic forces. They argue that there was something about the geography, genetics, or economy of Roman Mediterranean that made the rise of monotheist religion inevitable. Yet most historians tend to be skeptical of such deterministic theories. This is one of the distinguishing marks of history as an academic discipline. The better you know a particular historical period, the harder it becomes to explain why things happened one way and not another. Those who only have superficial knowledge of a certain period tend to focus only on the possibility that it was eventually realized. They offer a just-so story to explain with hindsight why that outcome was inevitable. Those more deeply informed about the period are much more cognizant of the roads not taken. In fact, the people who knew the period best, those alive at the time, were the most clueless of all. For the average Roman in Constantine's time, the future was a fog. It is an iron rule of history that what looks inevitable in hindsight was far from obvious at the time. Today is no different. Are we out of the global economic crisis, or is this worse still to come? Will China continue growing until it becomes the leading superpower? Will the United States lose its hegemony? Is the upsurge of monotheistic fundamentalism the wave of the future, or the local whirlpool of a small or little long-term insignificance? Are we heading towards an ecological disaster or technological paradise? There are good arguments to be made for all of these outcomes, but no way of knowing for sure. In a few decades, people will look back and think of the answers to all the questions, and think all of the answers to all the questions were obvious. It is particularly important to stress that the possibilities which seem very unlikely to contemporaries often get realized. When Constantine assumed the throne in 306, Christianity was little more than an esoteric Eastern sect. If you were to suggest then that it was about to become the Roman state religion, you'd have been laughed out of the room, just as you would be today if you suggest that by the year 2050, Hare Krishna would be the state religion of the USA. In October 1913, the Bolsheviks were a small radical Russian faction. No reasonable person would have predicted that within a mere 4 years they would take over the country. In AD 600, the notion that a band of desert-dwelling Arabs would soon conquer the expanse stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to India was even more preposterous. Indeed, had the Byzantine army been able to repel the initial onslaught, Islam would probably have remained an obscure cult which only a handful of cognoscenti were aware. Scholars would then have had a very easy job of explaining why faith based on religion, on a revelation. Scholars would then have had a very easy job explaining why a faith based on a revelation to a middle-aged Meccan merchant could have never caught on. Not that everything is possible. Geographical, biological, and economic forces create constraints. Yet these constraints leave ample room for surprising developments, which do not seem bound by any deterministic laws. This conclusion disappoints many people, who prefer history to be deterministic. Determinism is appealing because it implies that our world and our beliefs are natural and an inevitable product of history. It is natural and inevitable that we live in nation-states, organize our economy along capitalist principles, and fervently believe in human rights. To acknowledge that history is not deterministic is to acknowledge that it is just a coincidence that most people today believe in nationalism, capitalism, and human rights. History cannot be explained deterministically. It cannot be predicted because it's so chaotic. So many forces are at work, and their interactions are so complex that extremely small variations in the strength of the forces and the way in which they interact produce huge differences in outcomes. Not only that, but history is what is called level 2 chaotic system. Chaotic systems come in two shapes. Level 1 chaos is chaos that does not react to predictions about it. The weather, for example, is a level 1 chaotic system. Though it is influenced by a myriad of factors, we can build computer models that take more and more of them into consideration and produce better and better weather forecasts. Level 2 chaos is chaos that reacts to predictions about it, and therefore can never be predicted accurately. Markets, for example, are level 2, i.e. level 2 chaotic system. What will happen if we develop a computer program that forecasts with 100% accuracy the price of oil tomorrow? The price of oil will immediately react to the forecast, which would consequently fail to materialize. If the current price of oil is $90 a barrel, and the infallible computer program predicts that tomorrow it will be $100, traders will rush to buy oil so that they can profit from the predicted price rise. As a result, the price will shoot up to $100 a barrel today rather than tomorrow. Then what will happen tomorrow? Nobody knows. Politics, too, is a second-order chaotic system. Many people criticize Sovietologists for failing to predict the 1989 revolutions, and they castigate Middle East experts for not anticipating the Arab Spring revolutions of 2011. This is unfair. Revolutions are, by definition, unpredictable. A predictable revolution never erupts. Why not? Imagine that it's 2010 and some genius, political scientist, is in cahoots with a computer wizard, and they've developed an infallible algorithm that, incorporated into an attractive interface, can be marketed as a revolution predictor. They offer their services to President Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, and, in return for a generous down payment, tell Mubarak that according to their forecast, a revolution would certainly break out in Egypt during the course of the following year. How would Mubarak react? Most likely he would immediately lower taxes, distribute billions of dollars in handouts to the citizenry, and beef up his secret police force, just in case. The preemptive measures work. The year comes and goes, and, surprise, there's no revolution. Mubarak demands his money back. Your algorithm is worthless, he shouts at the scientists. In the end, I could have built another palace instead of giving all that money away. But the reason the revolution didn't happen is because we predicted it, the scientists say in their defense. Prophets who predict things that didn't happen. Prophets that predict things that don't happen Mubarak remarks, as he motions his guards to grab them. I could have picked up dozens of those for next to nothing in Cairo marketplace. So why study history? Unlike physics or economics, history is not a means for making accurate predictions. We study history not to know the future, but to widen our horizons, to understand that our present situation is neither neutral nor inevitable, and that we can consequently have many more possibilities before us than we imagine. For example, studying how Europeans came to dominate the Africas enables us to realize that there is nothing natural or inevitable about racial hierarchy, and that the world might well be arranged differently. Sapiens, Blind Cleo. We cannot explain the choices that history makes, but we can say something very important about them. History's choices are not made for the benefit of humans. There is no proof that human well-being inevitably improves as history rolls along. There is no proof that cultures that are beneficial to humans must inexorably succeed and spread, while less beneficial cultures disappear. There is no proof that Christianity was a better choice than Manichaeism, or that the Arab Empire was more beneficial than that of Sassanid Persians. There is no proof that history is working for the benefit of humans, because we lack an objective scale on which to measure such a benefit. Different cultures define the good differently, and we have no objective yardstick by which to judge them. The victors, of course, always believe that their definition is correct. But why should we believe the victors? Christians believe that the victory of Christianity over Manichaeism was beneficial to humankind. But if we do not accept the Christian worldview, then there's no reason to agree with them. Muslims believe that the fall of the Sassanid Empire into Muslim hands was beneficial to humankind. But these benefits are evident only if we accept the Muslim worldview. It may be that we'd all be better off if Christianity and Islam had been forgotten or defeated. Ever more scholars see cultures as a kind of mental infection or parasite, with humans as its unwitting host. Organic parasites, such as viruses, live inside the body of their hosts. They multiply and spread from one host to another, feeding off their hosts, weakening them, and sometimes even killing them. As long as the host lives long enough to pass on the parasite, it cares little about the condition of its host. In just this fashion, cultural ideas live inside the minds of humans. They multiply and spread from one host to another, occasionally weakening the hosts, and sometimes even killing them. A cultural idea, such as a belief in Christian heaven above the clouds, or communist paradise here on earth, can compel a human to dedicate his or her life to spreading that idea, even at the price of death. The human dies, but the idea spreads. According to this approach, cultures are not conspiracies concocted by some people in order to take advantage of others, as Marxists tend to think. Rather, cultures are mental parasites that emerge accidentally, and thereafter take advantage of all the people infected by them. This approach is sometimes called Mimetics. It assumes that just as an organic evolution is based on the replication of organic information, units called genes, so cultural evolution is based on the replication of cultural information, units called memes. Successful cultures are those that excel in reproducing their memes, irrespective of the costs and benefits to their human hosts. Most scholars in the humanities disdain mimetics, seeing it as an amateurish attempt to explain cultural process with crude biological analogies. But many of these same scholars adhere to mimetics' twin sister, postmodernism. Postmodernist thinkers speak about discourses rather than memes as the building blocks of culture. Yet they too see cultures as propagating themselves with little regard for the benefit of humankind. For example, postmodernist thinkers describe nationalism as a deadly plague that spread throughout the world in the 19th and 20th centuries, causing wars, oppression, hate, and genocide. The moment people in one country were infected with it, those in the neighbouring countries were also likely to catch the virus. The nationalist virus presented itself as beneficial for humans, yet it is beneficial mainly to itself. Similar arguments are common in the social sciences, under the aegis of the game theory. Game theory explains how, in multiplayer systems, views and behaviour patterns that harm all players nevertheless manage to take root and spread. Arms races are a famous example. Many arms races bankrupt those who take part in them without really changing the military balance of power. When Pakistan buys advanced aeroplanes, India responds in kind. When India develops nuclear bombs, Pakistan follows suit. When Pakistan enlarges its navy, India counters. At the end of the process, the balance of power may remain much as it was, but meanwhile, billions of dollars could have been invested into education or health. Billions of dollars that could have been invested into education or health are spent on weapons. Yet the arms race dynamic is hard to resist. Arms racing is a pattern of behavior that spreads itself like a virus from one country to another, harming everyone but benefiting itself, under the evolutionary criteria of survival and reproduction. Keep in mind that an arms race, like a gene, has no awareness. It does not consciously seek to survive and reproduce. Its spread is the unintended result of a powerful dynamic. No matter what you call it, game theory, postmodernism, or mimetics, the dynamics of history are not directed towards enhancing human well-being. There is no basis for thinking that most successful cultures in history are necessarily the best ones for Homo sapiens. Like evolution, history disregards the happiness of individual organisms, and individual humans, for their part, are usually far too ignorant and weak to influence the course of history to their own advantage. History proceeds from one junction to the next, choosing for some mysterious reason to follow first this path and then another. Around AD 1500, history made its most momentous choice, changing not only the fate of humankind, but arguably the fate of all life on Earth. We call it the Scientific Revolution. It began in Western Europe, a large peninsula on the western tip of Afro-Asia, which up until then played no important role in history. Why did the Scientific Revolution begin there of all places, and not in China or India? Why did it begin at the midpoint of the second millennium, AD, rather than 2 centuries before or 3 centuries later? We don't know. Scholars have proposed dozens of theories, but none of them is particularly convincing. History has a very wide horizon of possibilities, and many possibilities are never realized. It is conceivable to imagine history going on for generations upon generations while bypassing the scientific revolution, just as it is conceivable to imagine history without Christianity, without Roman Empire, and without gold coins.